Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about the #1 tight end draft strategy for our upcoming 2024 fantasy football leagues. Now, many of you may already have in mind a draft strategy that you're going to utilize in order to navigate rounds 1 through 16. But you also may be asking yourself the question, should I be drafting a stud tight end using early round draft capital on players such as Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Travis Kelce, and the player to the right of the screen, Sam LaPorta? Because many of us over the course of the last couple seasons have dealt with the lack of stability within this position, the lack of depth. Honestly, many of us have had a season in which we've had a starting tight end average between 6 to 7 fantasy points per game, and there's no worse feeling in fantasy football than that overall scenario. So as we approach our 2024 fantasy football leagues, I'll go ahead and present statistics and data in order to answer the question as to whether or not we should be investing in stud tight ends in the beginning of our draft, or potentially waiting for the later rounds in order to find sleepers that are going to be better investments for the overall draft capital that we utilize. Now, before we get into today's content, again, if you guys haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. Cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. Additionally, for those of you guys who want more content on the channel, or potentially my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings, be sure to travel down below and head on over to Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, you'll get my draft guide, you'll get my rankings. Those rankings will be sent to you and updated weekly over the course of this month, so you'll get those emails so that you have an advantage upon your league mates going into your 2024 fantasy football drafts. And the emails won't stop there, as I'll send you weekly rankings over the course of this entire season, weeks 1 through 17, all positions, including flex, half PPR, and full PPR. For those of you interested, of course, in getting my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, all you got to do is use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy and make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, and make sure that you're eligible via the right side of the screen based on your current location. And for those of you who have already gone ahead and used the code, or potentially aren't eligible to sign up via Underdog, you can also check out the Patreon where all this content is available and much more. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's talk about the tight end position going into 2024 and present statistics that really do speak to the lack of reliability at the tight end position. So as you can see to the right side of the screen, we have statistics over the course of the last decade of fantasy football. I've gone ahead and taken the cumulative fantasy points scored by the tight end ones in each of these seasons. The tight end ones being the top 12 players at the end of the year within the tight end position. Now, obviously, the last 3 seasons of fantasy football have consisted of 17 games in 18 weeks. So on a per-week basis, we find that, unfortunately, the 2023 season produced the 3rd lowest per-week average in comparison to the last decade of fantasy football. We're trending in the wrong direction, primarily because the top of the tight end position, the studs, unfortunately, as a collective, aren't as consistent anymore. And even though we do have guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, George Kittles of the world that are studs and within their own right producing on a weekly basis, unfortunately, the entire collective group of the top 12 tight ends doesn't follow as suit, which makes it very top heavy. And unfortunately, after the top is gone, it just becomes a wasteland at the position of players that are barely scraping by every single week based on their fantasy point contributions that are very much so reliant on touchdowns. Now, we'll get to that point in just a moment. Now, instead of just focusing on the top 12 tight ends at the position, I want to talk about the entire position as a whole over the course of the past decade. As you guys can see on screen, we have years 2014 through 2023, the past decade of fantasy football, and the total tight end receiving statistics being their targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now, luckily for all of us, as we approach 2024, there were some promising signs in terms of opportunity, which wasn't lacking in 2023. In fact, 2023 demonstrated the 3rd most targets and the most receptions amongst tight ends over the course of the past decade, which is an incredible sign to say the very least. But unfortunately, we saw quite literally the fewest volume of overall receiving touchdowns that the tight end position has experienced over the course of the last decade. And I don't say this lightly, but touchdowns are the lifeblood of the tight end position. And without touchdowns, the tight end position might as well just go extinct. And what we witnessed in 2023 was a serious impact on the overall success at said position. When you go ahead and take into account the fantasy points per target and fantasy points per reception, in terms of valuing the opportunities that our tight ends earned last season, unfortunately, we had the lowest numbers over the course of the past decade, with a 1.35 fantasy point per target and 1.9 fantasy point per reception average, mainly because the touchdowns just weren't there. And even though opportunity can be involved and on a consistent stream, when you're not scoring a high volume of fantasy points, I mean, we've been trending in the wrong direction. And 2023 certainly hit a rock bottom in comparison to the 3 seasons prior. But when we talk about the value of our overall opportunities, if touchdowns aren't going to be correlated with it, unfortunately, the fantasy points and the upside of our players are going to be non-existent, unfortunately. Just to put into perspective what a lack of touchdowns truly means within the tight end position, in 2023, there were only 6 tight ends that surpassed 150 fantasy points. Like I mentioned earlier, there isn't much depth at this position. And in fact, amongst all positions in fantasy football, it has the least volume of depth, even in comparison to team defenses and kickers. Last season, there were 9 kickers that surpassed 150 fantasy points and 6 team defenses that surpassed 150 fantasy points. Again, the tight end position, there's not much depth. And yes, there are studs at the very top, like the Kelce's and Mark Andrews that have been carrying our teams over the course of the last 5 seasons. But unless you have those guys, you've really felt the pain at the lack of depth within this position and the lack of consistency across the board. I mean, even last season, 2023, the Dallas Cowboys defense scored more fantasy points than Evan Ingram and Travis Kelce in a half PPR scoring format. And Evan Ingram and Travis Kelce finished as tight end 2 and tight end 3 overall. Going into our 2024 fantasy football drafts, guys like Justin Tucker have an ADP via ESPN of 91.2, and the Cleveland Browns defense has an ADP of 85.1. And if they're going to score more fantasy points than the tight ends that we draft far earlier, honestly, the investment of these kickers and defenses may take us farther throughout our fantasy football season, especially considering kickers and defenses often don't get injured. Again, defenses are not going to get injured, so you won't have to replace them until you get into a bye week or a bad matchup. But kickers, again, unless there's the crazy injury that's a season ender, often aren't getting injured and aren't giving you the potential risk that the tight end position provides. But let's go ahead and let's continue with the top 12 conversation at the tight end position by talking about drop-off in production. Because as you approach your 2024 fantasy football drafts, when you are considering potentially drafting a tight end, you're also considering avoiding a potential running back or wide receiver within that given selection. And using early draft capital between rounds 1 through 5 often mean that you are, neglecting your team a potential running back or wide receiver that can certainly help with even more potential fantasy points. But the reason why I talk about drop off in production, and just to give you guys an understanding as to what exactly is on screen to the right, I've gone ahead and taken the averages of the top 12 ranked players at each of these 3 flex positions: running back, wide receiver, and tight end in a half PPR scoring format. So over the course of the last 3 seasons, the number 1 overall running back in terms of averages based on those 3 players that were able to finish as RB1 overall within that given year, averaged 343.37 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Now, the reason why I want to go ahead and present drop off in production to give you an understanding just how quickly the tight end position falls off. I mean, really, the volume of fantasy points that the very bottom of the tight end 1 conversation provides on a yearly basis is minimal. So once you get past the top of the conversation, the top tier tight ends, everyone after that is far less valuable. And that certainly needs to be taken into account when we're making decisions regarding whether or not we are selecting an early tight end and using early draft capital on a stud. Now, the primary reason I introduced these statistics is because I'm going to continue to correlate tight end fantasy point contributions to the comparative values of, again, if I select Sam LaPorta within the 2nd or 3rd round, what am I giving up? What kind of fantasy production do the available running backs or wide receivers present in comparison? And how am I making the correct decision overall based on fantasy point contributions to my team within the upcoming season? And is there a positional advantage? So as you can see to the right side of the screen, we have positional equivalence. So the tight end 1 over the course of the last 3 seasons on average in a half PPR is equivalent to RB7 and wide receiver 7, and the tight end 2 being the equivalent of RB17 and wide receiver 19 in terms of fantasy points scored by the end of the season based on averages over the course of 2021 to 2023. And the reason why this is so important is because it gives you an understanding as to the equivalent value that you are getting and whether or not you should be selecting a potential wide receiver or running back in comparison to one of these stud tight ends within the early first 5 rounds of your 2024 fantasy football drafts. Now, for example, As it currently stands, Sam LaPorta has an ADP via Underdog Fantasy of 36.7. When we investigate and look at the volume of running backs and wide receivers that are selected before Sam LaPorta on Underdog drafts, we have on average 9 running backs and 25 wide receivers selected ahead of him. Now, like I just mentioned moments ago, and as you can see on screen, the equivalent is RB7. And when there's 9 running backs and 25 wide receivers selected ahead of Sam LaPorta, of course, the investment of selecting him at 36.7, especially considering he's one of few that really can compete to be the #1 overall tight end by the end of the season, that investment is incredible. Other people are using their draft capital on wide receivers when, quite frankly, you can go ahead and get a positional advantage from Sam LaPorta, who is going to be putting up far more fantasy points than the wide receivers that they are selecting around him. Now, currently on Sleeper, the ADP of Sam LaPorta is far more proportional to what it should be. 24.8 is what it currently sits at based on averages, with 8 running backs and 13 wide receivers selected ahead of him. And even then, there is still incredible value for Sam LaPorta, assuming, of course, he has the ability to finish as the #1 overall tight end. But considering people aren't selecting him earlier, it leads me to believe that there isn't as much of a confidence that Sam LaPorta is capable of doing that, incapable of scoring 230 plus fantasy points. And the same thing holds for Travis Kelce. At this current moment in time, there's a lot of uncertainty at the top of the tight end position, because really it doesn't look like anyone believes that Travis Kelce or Sam LaPorta can put up 230 fantasy points and be the undisputed #1 tight end within the given season. There's no confidence one way or the other. It almost seems like we have a tight end 2A and B, where we're thinking they're going to score between 180 to potentially 200 fantasy points this upcoming season, rather than the upside of getting to that 230 to 40 range, which we have seen tight end 1s overall be able to dominate at over the course of even the last 5 seasons. When you take 2019 to 2023 averages, it still stays within the conversation at 234.26 fantasy points per season on average. Now, with this all said, the discounts that we're receiving at the top of the tight end conversation within the studs is one that we haven't seen for a while. I mean, just going back to last season, Travis Kelce was picked like 1.07 on an average basis. He was going within the first round. A stud tight end that is able to score 230 plus fantasy points absolutely demands you to smash the draft button immediately. And yes, there are multiple players at the top of this position that can certainly claim that #1 overall standing. So to answer the question we've been revolving around this entire time, should we be drafting a stud tight end in our 2024 fantasy football leagues? The answer is yes. If you have an opportunity of using early round draft capital in order to bring in someone like Sam LaPorta, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, you absolutely should, because the lack of depth within the position and the fact that the position statistically is trending in the wrong direction over the course of the last decade, as there's been far less consistency across the board, you should be utilizing early draft capital to gain an advantage within the position. And based on the positional equivalence in comparison to the other wide receivers or running backs that are potentially available, the positional advantage that you are gaining by getting a top 4 potential tight end going into this upcoming year, in comparison to the drop-off that there is within the running back and wide receiver position, which certainly isn't as severe going into 2024, the investment of a stud tight end is absolutely one we should be making. That being said, I'm not going to count out the idea or potential strategy of waiting on the tight end position, because there certainly are statistics that kind of support the idea of waiting and potentially investing in one later in drafts. And you can do both. You can draft an early tight end and then go ahead and once again reinvest within the tight end position in hopes that you can hit on one sleeper that may eventually end up being trade fodder, or potentially someone that could end up being your starter by the end of the 2024 season. So unless you're going to make that early investment at the position, you have to wait. You have to be patient with the tight end position. Unless the tight end position going into 2024 is going to break every statistical record as a collective and put up the most amount of touchdowns, receiving yards, receptions over the course of the past decade, which again, we're not trending in the right direction for that. Everybody outside of the top 4 is being selected far too early based on the fantasy point contribution that they're going to provide to your team based on averages over the course of the last couple seasons. And sure, there are some players that are going to produce far beyond their averages and are going to really shake up the entire board, but the vast majority are going to stay within their means, and they're going to produce the fantasy points that we anticipate them to. So perhaps the strategy is waiting on the tight end position and maybe even just drafting a top tier defense or kicker that is going to stay healthy, is going to stay consistent, and is going to score just as many fantasy points as, top 4 tight ends that are selected earlier on. Maybe you can do all 3 of that, but Nonetheless, I want to talk about the position's reliability and a couple of the statistics that really do give us the potential of selecting someone in 2024 that isn't a top 12 player. Even though I do prefer that as a potential approach, going to any of my leagues, whether it do be a super flex, 2 QB league, whether it is a 1 quarterback league, whether it's a tight end. I mean, if it's a tight end premium league, you're selecting a tight end early. But when we talk about year over year consistency at tight end, being a tight end 1, top 12 at the position, and then following season also being a top 12 player, over the course of the last 5 seasons, we have experienced 26 different tight end performances that have been able to accomplish that. That's 5.2 tight ends per season that are able to finish as a tight end 1 and the following year finish as a tight end 1 again. Going into 2024, based on current ADPs, there are 9 tight ends that are expected to repeat. And based on history, we're probably not going to see that come to pass. Therefore, there is going to be a lot of other tight ends that get in within the mix in comparison to what the current ADP sits with, because there are going to be injuries, there's going to be inconsistency of play, and there are certainly going to be guys that come out of nowhere that claim a tight end 1 position, because over the course of the last 5 seasons, we have seen 22 different tight ends finish as a tight end 1, top 12 of the position, despite never being able to accomplish that ever before in their career. 4.4 of these per season, specifically just some of the names that we've seen, accomplish that over the course of the last 5 seasons, 2019 to 2023. In 2023, LaPorta, Ferguson, McBride, Kincaid. In 2022, Hill, Metcalf, Freiermuth, Johnson. 2021, Schultz, Pitts, Knox. 2020, Tunyon, Hawkinson, Thomas, Hurst, Smith. 2019, Waller, Andrews, Higbee, Henry, Goddard, Gesicki. You can find tight ends on the waiver wires over the course of the season. I mean, shoot, last season, weeks 12 through 18, after Mark Andrews went down with an injury, Isaiah Likely throughout that span of time was number 4 overall in terms of fantasy points per game on average and in terms of overall fantasy points scored at the tight end position to close the year. You can find a lot of help at the tight end position via the waiver wire. So if you're not able to select one of the top 4 tight ends, either because they're taken ahead of you or potentially because the running backs and wide receivers that are still there and available when you have an opportunity of selecting these tight ends are just far too good to give up, maybe you just go ahead and wait. You play patient at the tight end position. You draft someone like a Dallas Goedert or a Jake Ferguson in your later rounds, and then you wait for a potential waiver wire stud. Or you go ahead and have a little bit of initiative and you try to potentially throw the dart at the board and find someone within your draft that you can invest in and someone who could potentially finish as a tight end 1 at the end of the 2024 season. Because again, on a per season basis, we have seen 4.4 on average be able to accomplish that in a half PPR since 2019. So a couple of the names that I wanted to throw out. Potential players that are going to be first-time tight end 1s throughout their career. Brock Bowers, obviously, is the first player that we're anticipating. His ADP is already within the top 12 ranked tight ends, 82.1. But some of the sleepers, Luke Musgrave, Tyler Conklin, Cade Otton, Ben Sinnott, there are a lot of potential within these tight ends. And guys that, again, even if you are selecting a stud tight end early, you can go ahead and invest in one of these guys. But if you want to go ahead and avoid that investment of early draft capital, and you want to take a Dallas Goedert or a Jake Ferguson, or potentially a Brock Bowers, make sure you swing for the fences, because it really isn't going to hurt based on their current ADP and the investment that you are making based on where you're getting them within your drafts and the potential upside of, if in fact they hit, fantastic, you have another top 12 option at the tight end position that you can either trade away or utilize as your starter. And worst case scenario, if they don't hit, well, we're dropping them and we're going after one of these, waiver wire options that over the course of the last 5 seasons, there have been plenty of that have helped us win fantasy football championships, despite the fact that they haven't even been drafted within their given years. I'm thinking of names that I can remember making videos on via waiver wire, like Dawson Knox, Dalton Schultz back in 2021, Taysom Hill in 2022, guys that immediately found success at the tight end position, even though they were waiver wire pickups, which again, we can find every single season. So going into 2024, make that investment, draft a stud tight end. If you're not able to, punt on the position, be patient, draft a kicker, draft a defense that is a stud within their overall positions, take a discount at tight end, but then try to dig and see if you can get a tight end 1 with a late round investment for the potential names that we have on the right side of the screen. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Hopefully, this video helped you in regards to giving you an understanding as to why we are approaching the tight end position as such, valuing the studs, and if not, going after the studs, ignoring everyone within the middle and taking discounts and drafting sleepers. Thank you everybody for watching. Of course, subscribe, click the like button down below. Check out the draft guide via Patreon or via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.